Mastery hissed, his reptilian eyes narrowing as he glared at Nolan. If the human believes he can handle this creature, then let him prove it. Open the cage. The assistant hesitated, their feathered hands trembling as they input the security code. The reinforced door hissed open, revealing the dim interior of the enclosure. The Verak's golden eyes snapped to the opening, its growl deepening, but it didn't move from its corner. Its massive frame quivered, the dark blue fur rippling with tension. Nolan stood slowly, his hands raised in a non-threatening gesture. He stepped into the cage, the door sliding shut behind him with a final, ominous click. The air inside was thick with the scent of blood and musk, a primal reminder of the creature's nature. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, his voice calm and steady. "Easy now," he murmured, more to himself than to the Verak. "I'm not here to hurt you." The creature's ears twitched, its gaze locked onto him. The growl softened, but its muscles remained coiled, ready to spring. Nolan crouched again, maintaining a respectful distance. He could see the wound more clearly now, a deep gash along its flank, the edges inflamed and oozing dark fluid. It was infected, and the creature's shivering suggested a fever. "You're in bad shape, aren't you?" Nolan said softly, his eyes scanning the wound. "But you're not going to let anyone near you, are you? Not like this." The Verak's lips curled back, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth, but it didn't lunge. Its breathing was labored, its golden eyes flickering with a mix of pain and defiance. Nolan reached into his medical kit, pulling out a small injector filled with a sedative. He held it up, showing it to the creature as if it could understand. "This will help," he said. "It'll take the edge off, make it easier for me to treat you. But I need you to trust me, just a little." The Verak's growl returned, louder this time, and it shifted slightly, its massive paws scraping against the floor. Nolan froze, his heart pounding, but he didn't back away. He kept his eyes on the creature's, his voice steady. "I know you're scared," he said, "and I know you don't trust me. But if I don't treat that wound, it's going to get worse. You don't want that, do you?" For a moment, the Verak seemed to hesitate. Its ears flicked forward, and its gaze softened ever so slightly. Nolan took a sly, cautious step closer, the injector held out in front of him. The creature's growl faded into a low rumble, its body still tense but no longer poised to strike. "That's it," Nolan murmured. "Just a little closer." He was within arm's reach now, close enough to see the fine details of the Verak's fur, the way its muscles twitched with every breath. He moved slowly, carefully, until the injector was pressed against the creature's flank. The Verak flinched but didn't pull away. Nolan pressed the trigger, and the sedative hissed into the creature's bloodstream. The Verak's golden eyes widened for a moment, then began to droop. Its massive body sagged, the tension draining away as the sedative took effect. Nolan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding and quickly set to work, cleaning and stitching the wound with practiced efficiency. Outside the cage, the alien medical staff watched in stunned silence. Mesri's scaled face was unreadable, but his forked tongue flicked out in what might have been surprise, or grudging respect. When Nolan finally stepped out of the cage, the Verak was resting peacefully, its breathing steady and its wound properly treated. The human veterinarian wiped his hands on a cloth and turned to Mesri, his expression calm but firm. "Next time," he said, "don't wait 3 cycles to call me." Mesri's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. The other medical professionals exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier fear replaced by something akin to awe. Nolan Graves, the human veterinarian, had done what they had deemed impossible. And in the cage, the Verak slept, its golden eyes closed, its trust, however fleeting, earned. "It's going to follow me around now?" Nolan asked, his voice tinged with a mix of amusement and disbelief. Mesri's reptilian face twisted into something resembling a grimace. "Precisely," he hissed. "It will consider you part of its domain. You are now, in its eyes, something to be protected, or perhaps tolerated. This is not a bond of affection, human. It is a matter of instinct. You have proven yourself useful, and now it will not let you go." Nolan glanced back at the Verak, which was now sprawled out on the clinic floor, its massive chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Its golden eyes were half-lidded, watching him with a lazy, almost contented gaze. He couldn't help but chuckle. "Well, that's a new one," he said, scratching the back of his head. I've had patients get attached before, but this is a whole new level. Mashri's tail lashed in irritation. This is not a joke, human. A Verak is not a pet. It is a predator, a killer. It will not hesitate to destroy anything it perceives as a threat to you, or to itself, and if it decides you are no longer useful. He trailed off, his meaning clear. Nolan raised an eyebrow. So what? I'm just supposed to leave it here and hope it doesn't follow me. Mashri's nostrils flared. That would be the wisest course of action. Let it return to its natural habitat. It will forget you in time. Nolan looked back at the Verak, which had now rolled onto its side, its massive paws twitching slightly as it dozed. He sighed. Yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. Look at it. It's not exactly in a hurry to leave. Mashri let out a frustrated growl. Then you have doomed yourself, human. You have made a grave error in judgment. Nolan shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. Maybe. Oh, maybe I've just made a new friend. Either way, I'm not leaving it here to suffer. If it wants to stick around, that's its choice. I'll deal with the consequences. Mashri stared at him for a long moment, his scaled face unreadable. Finally, he exhaled sharply, his forked tongue flicking out in a gesture of exasperation. You humans are either the bravest or the most foolish species I've ever encountered. Perhaps both. Nolan grinned. Yeah, we get that a lot. As Mashri and the other medical staff retreated to a safe distance, Nolan turned his attention back to the Verak. It was still watching him, its golden eyes now fully open, its gaze steady and intense. He crouched down, meeting its eyes. All right, big guy, he said softly. Looks like you're stuck with me for a while. Just try not to eat anyone, okay? The Verak let out a low, rumbling sound that might have been a growl, or maybe a chuckle. Nolan couldn't be sure, but as he stood and began packing up his medical kit, the creature shifted slightly, its massive body moving to block the exit of the cage. It wasn't aggressive, just possessive. Nolan sighed, shaking his head. Yeah, this is going to be interesting. And as he stepped out of the clinic, the Verak following close behind, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of pride. He had faced down one of the galaxy's most feared predators, and somehow, against all odds, he had earned its trust. Now, if only he could figure out what to do with it. Plan. Mashri hissed, his voice a mix of disbelief and horror. You are going to use an apex predator as a distraction. Nolan shrugged, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. More like a solution. Look, these pirates aren't expecting a Verak. They're expecting scared civilians and overwhelmed security. They won't know what hit them. Mashri's reptilian eyes narrowed, his forked tongue flicking out in agitation. And what if the Verak decides you are part of the problem? What if it turns on you, or worse, on all of us? Nolan glanced back at the Verak, which was crouched low, its golden eyes fixed on the pirates down the corridor. Its massive frame was coiled like a spring, ready to explode into motion. He could feel the tension radiating off it, a primal energy that made the air itself seem heavier. It won't, Nolan said, his voice firm. It's imprinted on me, remember? I'm part of its territory now. And right now, those pirates are a threat to its territory. Mashri opened his mouth to argue, but another explosion rocked the station, closer this time. The pirates were advancing, their voices loud and taunting as they moved from room to room, searching for loot or hostages. Nolan took a deep breath, steadying himself. Stay here, he said to Mashri. If this goes sideways, get to safety. But if it works, well, let's just say these pirates are about to have a very bad day. Before Mashri could protest further, Nolan stepped out into the corridor, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. The pirates turned immediately, their weapons snapping up to aim at him. Hey, easy. Nolan called out, his voice calm but loud enough to carry. I'm unarmed. Just a vet, okay. No threat to you. The lead pirate, a burly humanoid with a scarred face and a plasma rifle slung over his shoulder, sneered. A vet? What? You here to fix our broken bones after we wrecked this place? The others laughed, their weapons still trained on Nolan. They hadn't noticed the shadowy figure lurking just around the corner. Something like that, Nolan said, his eyes flicking to the Varrock for the briefest of moments. "But I think you might have bigger problems." The lead pirate frowned, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. "What's that supposed to?" He never finished the sentence. The Varrock moved like a bolt of lightning, its massive form exploding into motion with a speed that defied its size. One moment it was crouched in the shadows, the next, it was among the pirates, its claws slashing through armor and flesh alike. The lead pirate didn't even have time to scream before he was knocked to the ground, his weapon clattering out of his hands. The other two pirates opened fire, but their shots went wild, the Varrock's movements too fast to track. One of them managed to land a glancing blow, the plasma bolt searing a line across the Varrock's flank, but it barely seemed to notice. With a snarl, it lunged, its jaws closing around the pirate's arm and yanking him off his feet. The third pirate turned to run, but the Varrock was already on him, a single swipe of its massive paw sending him crashing into the wall. He slumped to the ground, unconscious, or worse. Nolan stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding in his chest. The entire encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds. The corridor was now eerily silent, save for the low, rumbling growl of the Varrock as it stood over its fallen prey, its golden eyes scanning for more threats. Mashri stepped out from around the corner, his face pale. That was horrifying. Nolan exhaled shakily, his hand still raised. Yeah, but it worked. The Varrock turned its gaze to Nolan, its ears twitching. For a moment, he thought it might lunge at him, but instead, it patted over and pressed its head against his chest, just as it had done in the clinic. The gesture was almost affectionate. Mashri stared, his mouth hanging open. It protected you." Nolan nodded, his hand instinctively reaching up to stroke the Varrock's thick fur. "I told you. It thinks I'm part of its territory now, and it doesn't take kindly to threats." Mashri shook his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "You are either the luckiest human alive or the most reckless. Possibly both." Nolan grinned, though his legs were still trembling. "Like I said, we get that a lot." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both tense, but it was only a group of station security officers, their weapons drawn but their faces filled with relief when they saw the downed pirates. "Dr. Graves," one of them called out. "Are you?" He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes widening as he took in the sight of the Varrock standing protectively beside Nolan. Nolan raised a hand. "It's okay. With me." The security officers exchanged uneasy glances, but they didn't lower their weapons. The Varrock let out a low growl, its golden eyes narrowing, and they quickly took a step back. "Right," Nolan said, patting the Varrock's side. "Let's get this mess cleaned up, and maybe figure out what to do with my new friend here." As the security officers moved to secure the pirates, Mashri stepped closer to Nolan, his voice low. "You realize this is only the beginning, don't you? That creature is not going to let you out of its sight. You have essentially adopted an apex predator." Nolan glanced down at the Varrock, which was now sitting calmly at his side, its tail flicking lazily. "Yeah," he said with a sigh. "I know. But hey, at least I won't have to worry about pirates anymore." Mashri groaned, pinching the bridge of his scaled nose. "You humans are going to be the death of me." Nolan chuckled, though his mind was already racing with the implications of what he'd just done. He had a feeling life aboard Varros Prime was about to get a lot more interesting, and a lot more dangerous. But for now, he was alive. And so was everyone else on the station. That was good enough for him. Nolan leaned back in his chair, the soft hum of the station's systems filling the quiet of his quarters. Sable, the Varrock, lay sprawled in the corner, her massive frame taking up most of the available space. Her golden eyes were half-lidded, watching him with a calm intensity that had become familiar over the past few days. Despite her imposing presence, there was something almost comforting about her being there. He glanced at the datapad on his desk, scrolling through the latest reports from the station's medical team. The aftermath of the pirate attack had kept everyone busy, but things were finally starting to settle down. The station's security had managed to round up the remaining pirates, and repairs were underway. Nolan had even received a few messages of gratitude from the station's administrators, though they were careful to avoid mentioning the Varrock in their notes. Mashri, on the other hand, had been less subtle. The reptilian chief veterinarian had sent Nolan a lengthy message detailing the numerous violations of protocol and reckless endangerment of station personnel that Nolan had allegedly committed. Nolan had skimmed it once, chuckled, and then deleted it. He knew Mastery was just blowing off steam. Deep down, even the stubborn alien had to admit that Nolan's unorthodox methods had saved lives. Sable let out a low, rumbling sound, drawing Nolan's attention. He turned to see her stretching, her claws scraping against the floor as she rose to her feet. She padded over to him, her movements fluid and silent, and nudged his hand with her massive head. All right, Nolan said with a grin, scratching behind her ears. I get it. You're bored. Sable huffed, her breath warm against his skin. She tilted her head, her golden eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, Nolan felt a strange sense of understanding pass between them. It was as if she was trying to tell him something important. You know, he said, his voice soft, you're not what I expected when I came here, but I think you might be exactly what I needed. Sable let out a soft growl, almost like a purr, and leaned into his touch. Nolan couldn't help but laugh. Yeah, I think you're stuck with me too. The comm unit on his desk chimed, interrupting the moment. Nolan sighed and reached over to answer it. The holographic display flickered to life, revealing the face of the station administrator, an insectoid bureaucrat with a frazzled expression. Dr. Graves, the administrator said, their voice clipped and formal. We need to discuss the situation with the Verak. Nolan raised an eyebrow. What situation? The administrator hesitated, their antennae twitching nervously. The creature cannot remain on the station indefinitely. It is a danger to the crew and a liability to station operations. We must find a way to relocate it. Sable let out a low growl, her ears flattening against her head. Nolan placed a calming hand on her flank. Relocate her. To where? She's not exactly a house pet. The administrator's mandibles clicked in agitation. That is not our concern. The Verak is a wild animal, and it belongs in its natural habitat. We cannot allow it to remain here. Nolan leaned back in his chair, his expression hardening. With all due respect, Sable saved the station. She took down a pirate boarding party single-handedly. If anything, she's an asset. The administrator's eyes narrowed. Dr. Graves, you are not in a position to. Nolan cut them off. Look, I get it. She's big, she's scary, and she doesn't fit into your neat little protocols. But she's not going anywhere. Not unless she wants to. The administrator opened their mouth to argue, but Sable let out a deafening roar, her golden eyes blazing. The holographic display flickered, and the administrator's image wavered for a moment before stabilizing. They stared at Nolan, their expression a mix of fear and frustration. Fine, the administrator said finally, their voice tight. But this is not over, Dr. Graves. We will be discussing this further. The comm unit went dark, and Nolan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Sable nudged him again, her growl softening into a low rumble. Yeah, I know, Nolan said, scratching it behind the ears. They don't get it. But that's okay. We'll figure it out. Sable let out a soft huff, her tail flicking lazily. Nolan smiled, leaning back in his chair. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose. He had come to Varos Prime to heal creatures that no one else understood, and in a way, he had done just that. Sable was more than just a patient. She was a partner, a protector, and maybe even a friend. And as he sat there, with the massive Verak at his side, Nolan couldn't help but feel that he was exactly where he was supposed to be.